The Locked On Podcast Network presents the NFL Big 3 in 30. The 3 biggest stories in the NFL from our local experts at the Locked On Podcast Network. We bring you the real story, why it matters, what's next, who wins the big game, and more, all in 30 minutes. The NFL Big 3 in 30 starts now with the biggest story in the NFL.
5 potential NFL draft quarterback fits for the New Orleans Saints. 2 day 2 fringe day 1 quarterbacks could present the New Orleans Saints with more options at number 9 at different positions, and then still cash in on the potential of a future franchise quarterback if the Saints feel highly about these 2 players. And I want to start off with Ole Miss quarterback Jackson Dart. Then we're going to go Alabama quarterback Jalen Milroe. When it comes to Jackson Dart, he feels like he has been the most consistently tied to the organization passer in this year's NFL draft, and kind of most meaningfully tied as well. Kellen Moore going to his pro day. They got an up-close look at him as well at the Senior Bowl as a participant there. Adam Schefter over at ESPN mentioning in a tweet the other day that the Saints have spent considerable time, or that Jackson Dart has spent considerable time, quote unquote, with the Saints throughout the interview process, along with a few other teams. And so now it feels like there's a lot of momentum still, or that there's been the most momentum in terms of what has been consistent and what has been sustained momentum in the quarterback draft conversation between Jackson Dart and the New Orleans Saints than any other quarterback in this class. It feels like the peak of momentum has been around Shedeur Sanders, but the most consistent momentum has been around Jackson Dart, and I think that's for good reason. Let's take a look at, and I think that good reason, by the way, is that there's genuine interest there. At least they've done all the things that signal genuine interest. Like the Saints have not been quiet at all, or behind closed doors, or shy about being interested in Jackson Dart. It's clear that there is some interest there. So why is that? Let's take a look at each of our 5 criteria that we're diving into today. Positive. Mobility in the pocket, and works really, really well out of structure, creating like secondary passing opportunities, can play a little bit of that playground ball, kind of fits the same as a couple of the other passers that we've already talked about, but just seems very, very comfortable in these situations. Really good at understanding passing concepts and wide receiver route combinations. That Lane Kiffin offense kind of elevated that for him, but it's also his negative as well. Most people, when they talk about the negatives around Jackson Dart, doesn't come down to things like decision making. He's only thrown 11 interceptions over the course of the past 2 years, just 6 interceptions last year. But instead, it's the offense and the system that he plays in. Lane Kiffin's offense is one of those wide open offenses that's considered quote unquote easy for quarterbacks because it's half field reads. It's a lot of half field read concepts to where you're, sending one player on a go route, and then you're running another player on a corner route that cuts underneath that go, and then there's a running back out in the flat. Dan Orlovsky broke down a play just like this in a recent episode of one of his shows, and what you see is the ability to, or not necessarily the ability, but the freedom, I guess I would say, and ability, right? Because he also does it successfully, but the freedom and comfort to be able to just read one side of the field. What is this defender doing as the conflict defender? But I think that's okay. I think in today's NFL, that's not uncommon to have to take a quarterback from one spot in college where you're reading half the field and say, okay, now you're coming to the pros, learn how to read the entire field. And I really doubt that there's a lot of coaching staffs out there that don't believe that they can train that don't believe that they can coach that. Like I said, with a lot of the negatives and hits and, criticisms that you're going to hear about all 5 of these quarterbacks, every coaching staff in the NFL believes they can fix these things. If not, then they shouldn't be coaching, right? And so I think that that's something that I really look at and go, okay, well, that's not an uncommon leap for a young quarterback to make from college to the pros. So I'm not too concerned about that. But the idea of manipulating a conflict defender and using your eyes to manipulate that defender, we see that on Jackson Dart's tape. Pretty good stuff to see there. What's his draft projection? I think it's safe to call him a fringe first rounder, which isn't to say that he would go late in the first round. It's just that there's projections of him in the first round and there's projections of him in the second round, or potentially being a trade up target in the bottom of the first round. So he kind of exists in between those 2 rounds. So I think giving the fringe first tag is reasonable. How do the Saints get him? Well, they could draft him at 9. Lance Moore over at the Saints Squad show that we did on Monday. By the way, the next Saints Squad show is tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Central Time, where we'll be live. Myself, Dylan Sanders, John Hendricks, and Lance Moore. He talked about how drafting a quarterback at number 9 isn't the worst decision if the organization believes that player can be a franchise quarterback. So if they think of Jackson Dart in that way, just draft him at 9. If you don't want to necessarily go that route, though, you can wait until 40 and see if he's there in the second round, or like we mentioned, a trade up late in the first round to be able to get back into that first round, get that 5th-year option on him, and select him at the end of the first. Who stands in the way? Pretty much all quarterback needy teams, because every NFL team right now still owns its original first round picks. Like the first time in like 20 years that this has happened. And so therefore, every quarterback needy team stands in your way between you and you again, between 9 and 40. And so I would say specifically, though, I would highlight the Cleveland Browns early in round 2 at pick 33. If they don't go with the quarterback in the first round, could circle back to a quarterback early in the second round. And then, of course, Pittsburgh at 21 stands in your way because it's in between your pick at 9 and your pick at 40. Let's take a look at Jalen Milroe next. A big positive for him. I mean, incredible athlete. And as a passer, a pretty good deep ball as well. 104.2 passer rating in 2024 on passes that traveled more than 20 yards through the air downfield. Has a pretty good deep ball, and of course is just a remarkable playmaker with the ball in his hands. Has a scrambling quarterback, designed runs, all of those things. The negative around him kind of looks like it's in that short intermediate area of passing. His passer ratings hover around 82 in the short and intermediate areas in 2024, and 10 of his 16 passing touchdowns came through passes 20 yards downfield in terms of air yards. So you could see that comfort downfield isn't necessarily there for him in the short and intermediate areas and things like that. So that's a big thing to have to work on. But we've seen quarterbacks come into the NFL with similar criticism and turn into starters. And with both of these quarterbacks, Dart and Milroe, there's a Hurts-esque asset or piece to it of like Jalen Hurts was highly criticized coming into the NFL as being a better runner than a passer, needing to shape up his accuracy and anticipation and ball placement and things like that. And so you see elements of that in both of these passers, Milroe's more specifically probably, particularly as a dynamic rushing threat. So Jalen Hurts looked great working with Doug Nussmeier as the quarterback's coach, as well as Kellen Moore as the offensive coordinator. Now Doug Nussmeier here in New Orleans as the offensive coordinator, while Kellen Moore is the head coach. So in Philly, it worked. Could you find some similar growth with the player over the course of his rookie contract here with a guy like Jalen Milroe? Draft projection seems to be pretty comfortably day 2, either round 2 or round 3. So that would put the Saints, in terms of what they would have to do to get him, potentially selecting him in round 2, pick 40, or potentially selecting him in round 3, pick 71. I think you run the risk waiting any longer than that if he's still on the board because of Pittsburgh drafting at not only 21, but also 83, 10 selections before you're back on the board in the 3rd round. So I guess you could try to move back up in the 3rd round if you want to, leverage one of those 4th round picks and then move up and get another pick closer to 71 if you wanted to get kind of back-to-back or tight in the 3rd round. But you don't necessarily have to. You could just take him at 71 if that's the case. And so for Milroe, feels like day 2 is a good spot. But look, he accepted an invitation to the draft, and the fact that the NFL invited him at all to Green Bay for the draft tells you that there's at least some chance that he also ends up going in the 1st round. So we have to acknowledge the fringe first nature of Jalen Milroe as well. So I also highlight the Pittsburgh Steelers at 21 as a possible investment worth making, or a team that wants to draft him and take him into being a different position from quarterback. They could potentially go a little bit earlier for him as well.
Outs in the game, end of the 8th inning and through the 9th, through 30 pitches and picks up his 2nd win of the year. Another scoreless outing for Taijuan Walker. Now 10 2/3 of scoreless baseball from the Phillies, now 5th starter. Not too bad for Taijuan Walker. And then, how about this? 363 pitches. I said it was a long game. 363 pitches in total, and the game in the pitch clock era going over the 3-hour mark. Phillies are going to try to win the series against the Braves with Jesus Luzardo on the hill, taking on Spencer Schwellenbach.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast.
I want to go specifically into what it would take for some of the top draft prospects to realistically fall to the Chicago Bears with the 10th overall pick. So Abdul Carter from Penn State, not going to fall to the Bears at 10. Travis Hunter, not going to fall to the Bears at 10. But Mason Graham from Michigan, or running back Ashton Jeanty from Boise State, or some of the top offensive line prospects like Will Campbell or Armand Membu, maybe a little bit more in reach. And we'll take a closer look at what that could look like on draft day. Let's start with Mason Graham specifically, because I think he's the one who feels most out of reach and least likely to make it to 10. And yet, if you play with any of the online mock draft simulators that go through picks for every team and then put you on the clock for the Bears, sometimes when you go through a simulation, Mason Graham is still there at 10. Doesn't happen very often. I don't think of it as very likely, but there is some logic and some potential path there for somehow the other top 9 teams picking before the Bears to let someone like Mason Graham go. And I think with Graham in particular, it's tricky because, if he gets past, 5 or 6, he seems like the kind of player that other teams might then try and trade up to get. Like, once he starts falling, is he going to fall all the way to 10? Realistically, probably not. But let's look at what that could look like. How might he start falling? And I think there's a couple of key factors in here. First of all, things change quickly if Colorado quarterback Shedeur Sanders goes in the top 3 of this draft. We talked about him, I think it was earlier this week or late last week, about him as a wild card that can reshape what prospects are available for the Bears at 10. And if that quarterback comes off in the top 3, then that means either Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter then makes it to number 4 for the New England Patriots. Presumably, the Patriots would take either one of those 2 guys if they make it to 4, and then that frees up whatever player the Patriots might have taken in that spot, whether it was one of the top offensive linemen, whether it would have been potentially Mason Graham himself, whether it's Ashton Jeanty or Tyler Warren. The Patriots are kind of a wild card here that could take any of the players the Bears might be interested in. But if the Patriots then take the other one of Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter, whoever falls out of the top 3, then that leaves the Jaguars with a whole open gamut to go offensive line if they want to go running back if they want to go tight end if they want to. They've got room to add at pretty much any of those positions. The Jaguars are the big team that everyone is expecting to take Mason Graham for one reason or another. They have the big need on the defensive line, and everyone seems to think they're the team that's going to take him. But if the Patriots get one of those top 3 prospects and leave the entire board open to the Jaguars among everybody else, they could be convinced to go in another direction there. And then if Mason Graham gets past the Jaguars at 5, it becomes even easier from there to try and figure out how he gets down to 10. Because if you look at the other teams picking after the Jaguars at 5, the Raiders could use some interior defensive line help. Any of these teams picking after them could potentially want to just add a good player at that position. But we think about the Raiders being a team that could go with a running back like Jeanty or a quarterback like Shedeur Sanders if he doesn't go in the top 3. Or even a wide receiver like Tet McMillan or a defensive back. So a lot of different directions the Raiders could go there. The Jets don't necessarily need a big investment in the defensive line. They have Quinnen Williams. They have Will McDonald. They just used a first-round pick 2 years ago. On the edge, they got Jermaine Johnson, also a first-round pick. They've invested a lot in that defensive line, and maybe they look at it and say, we don't necessarily need to use another first-round pick on another defensive lineman. Same kind of conversation, I think, for the Carolina Panthers, who gave Derek Brown that big contract. They have Jadeveon Clowney. They signed Tershawn Wharton to a huge deal from the Kansas City Chiefs. They put a lot of money into that defensive line as well. Do they have to get somebody like Mason Graham? Not necessarily. And then even the Saints, right? They've got Brian Bresee they drafted in the first round a couple years ago. They still have Cam Jordan and Chase Young and Carl Granderson on the edge. They used a second-round pick on Isaiah Foskey. They've got Kalen Saunders from the Chiefs. They've got plenty of defensive line depth in New Orleans. And all of a sudden, you can kind of talk yourself into, these teams don't necessarily need a defensive tackle. And so then it becomes a question of, do they just purely view Mason Graham as best player available, and they're going to take him because he's a good player, as opposed to taking a position they might have a greater need for. And if they just feel like, well, maybe they have some question marks about Mason Graham, as great of a prospect as he is. And I'm not here to tear him down as a prospect, but he has some shorter arms compared to other defensive tackles. Length is not a strength for him. Just in general, his body is not particularly impressive from a size and length standpoint. There's some thoughts that maybe he had a little bit of unnecessary weight as well. Like, it's not perfectly chiseled in the perfect form of what you would want from a defensive tackle. And also his production for all the finger pointing we do to Shamar Stewart and Mykel Williams as edge rushers that don't have a lot of production. Mason Graham hasn't exactly lit up the stat sheet either. 9 career sacks in 3 seasons. Last year was 3.5. He had 3 the year before that and 2.5 the year before that. I'm not saying Mason Graham's not a great prospect, but you could see where if individual teams will have different scouting reports on this player and value different things from defensive tackles, if you're a team like the Saints or the Panthers or the Jets or whoever, and you say, well, we don't really need a defensive lineman, and we do have some questions about his length and about his sack production, so we would rather go with a player who we also think is good, but doesn't have, but fills a need for us and is close enough to best player available. Also, you can start to talk yourself into, okay, so, say the Patriots get Travis Hunter, so then the Jaguars take a defensive back, or maybe take an offensive lineman there. Say they go Will Campbell at 5, and then the Raiders take Ashton Genty, and then the Jets take somebody like Armand Membu at tackle, and then maybe the Panthers go Will Johnson, the cornerback from Michigan, and then the Saints go Tyler Warren from Penn State, and all of a sudden you've talked your way into Mason Graham being there at 10. Like I've said, it doesn't sound super likely. At the end of the day, one of those teams will probably view Mason Graham as best player available, even if it's not a huge need, and or a team that sees Mason Graham falling past the Patriots at 4 and past the Jaguars at 5 might trade up into that 6 through 9 range to try and land a top player in this draft that they see as falling, that is much more attainable if you're trading up to 7 than it is trying to trade up to 4 or 5 to try and get him. And so it's possible, not likely, and I wanted to go through what that could look like if it were to somehow happen. I think it's a little bit more likely that a top player like Ashton Genty at running back falls to the Bears. It's a little tough to do the right NFL draft gymnastics to get Mason Graham to fall naturally all the way to the Bears at the 10th overall pick. It's a little easier to find that path for Ashton Genty, but I do still personally believe he's the type of running back prospect that won't make it to 10, but he'll get a lot closer to 10 than Mason Graham. I think Graham probably doesn't escape the top 5. The Patriots at 4, the Jaguars at 5. One of those two teams is going to take him, or trade down with someone who's going to trade into the top 5 to take him. Genty could go as high as 4 to the Patriots, or could go even past the Bears at 10 and fall into 11, 12, 13, 14 kind of draft range. He has a more wider possibility of outcomes here. Like I said, I think the first team threat there is the New England Patriots at 4. If Mike Vrabel really feels like he wants his workhorse running back to play that Derrick Henry type role in New England. Not that he and Derrick Henry are the same player at all, but just to be that game-changing running back in his backfield and be an upgrade over Ramondre Stevenson for them. You could see the Patriots being the first sort of wild card team there. But then the Jaguars are a team that I think you can't rule it out as a possibility, given how ETN struggled a bit this past season and Bigsby kind of emerged as more of a lead back there. I think they're not out of the question. The Raiders obviously have a lot more of a hole at running back, and if they don't go QB there, they seem like a pretty strong potential landing spot for Genty. They signed Raheem Mostert in free agency, but he's on the wrong side of 30. Well, he's 33 now. He just turned. So they definitely have a big opening there. And pretty much, the other teams, the Jets, there have been rumors that they could draft Genty and trade Breece Hall, their number 1 running back. The Saints have been long rumored to be looking for a long-term Alvin Kamara replacement to get somebody in the building and have a better backfield there and a long-term future with him. I mean, just about the only team in the top 10, or I guess in the 4 through 9 range that I don't see as an Ashton Genty landing spot is the Carolina Panthers, because they just signed Rico Dowdle as a free agent. They have Chuba Hubbard, who was a 1,000-yard rusher last season, and they drafted Jonathan Brooks in the early second round last year. So their backfield seems pretty loaded. and they're just not going to be necessarily an Ashton Jeanty team. So Jeanty's one of those guys that could go in any of those spots or could slip by any of those spots, because any of those teams could look at this and say, well, running back's just not worth it for us here in the top 10. The Patriots at 4 might look at this and say, hey, there's a couple of great offensive linemen they could take. Mason Graham could be there. Abdul Carter could be there. Travis Hunter could be there. They could go Tyler Warren from Penn State. They could go Tet McMillan from Arizona, the wide receiver. Like, there's going to be O-line, D-line, wide receivers, and tight ends that could all be interesting to Patriots, potentially more than someone like Ashton Jeanty. Not as a knock on Jeanty, but just because of where they're picking in the draft and the talent still available there. The Jaguars at 5, maybe not as big of a need for running back. They're more likely to go DB, DL, O-line, maybe even wide receiver. But, it's most likely going to be, everyone's kind of penciling in Mason Graham, though, theirs. But if the Patriots say they go O-line and the Jaguars go D-line, and maybe the Raiders then go quarterback if Shedeur Sanders falls all the way to them at that spot, the Jets might turn around and say, hey, listen, we could take Jeanty, but we could really use, another offensive tackle, somebody like Will Campbell or Armand Membu could be a good fit there, or they could even go somewhere like wide receiver or tight end. We obviously already mentioned the Panthers aren't going to go running back for the most part, so they go someone probably on defense for them. And then the Saints, really a wild card team here also. It could go corner, could go O-line, could maybe go tight end or wide receiver or D-line. Like, it's not out of the question to find that path. Like, Jeanty is one of those prospects that all it's going to take is one team to absolutely fall in love with him and he's going top 10. Or it could be a draft where teams are saying, listen, running backs just aren't worth it for us at the top of the draft, and we need to get more of those premium positions. It's not like, like when the Lions took Jahmyr Gibbs a couple years ago, right? That wasn't their natural pick slot in the draft. They happened to be a playoff team or a borderline playoff team. I don't remember exactly at the time what their record was, but they happened to be picking in the top 10. They traded down to 12 and still took Jahmyr Gibbs in that spot. Like, it tends to be the teams that have the luxury of adding a running back that can take one there, because the team doesn't have a bunch of other massive needs that they feel like they need to fill in that spot. And I'm not sure that any of these teams picking before the Bears in the top 10 are in that position of saying, hey, let's just grab this player because we have room for more of a luxury pick, right? Like, the Patriots are still trying to build from scratch. The Jaguars are in transition. The Raiders are in transition. The Jets are in transition. The Saints are in transition. And the Panthers don't really need a running back. Like, the Panthers are the one team that might be in the best team position to say, hey, screw it. Let's take more of a splurge kind of luxury pick position, because of that they're trying to be on this upswing to put them over the top, but they just don't actually need the running back. And so that makes it easier for somebody like Jeanty to make it to the Bears at 10. I think running back and tight end are in a similar conversation with Tyler Warren from Penn State, right? Where teams might view him as this offensive weapon that you just need to have because he's the best player available on your draft board, even if he's not a huge need. But teams could also look at it and say, hey, this isn't a tight end that we view as worthy of a top 10 pick. And maybe that's a little bit too much of a luxury for us. Because again, like, it could go as early as the Patriots at 4. The Jaguars aren't out of the question. I think the Raiders are the only team for Warren that you look at and say they're absolutely not going to take Tyler Warren because they have Brock Bowers and, for now, Michael Mayer, who they drafted a couple years ago, who they're probably going to trade. But still, Brock Bowers, they're not going to draft another first-round tight end with the Raiders. But then the Jets could use a tight end upgrade. Panthers could use a tight end upgrade. The Saints are rumored to be interested in Tyler Warren, even though I don't necessarily see it as a big need for them, but evidently the Saints are fired up about Tyler Warren, so they're definitely a part of this conversation. And again, it's like, well, do those teams say, hey, this tight end is just so good that we have to take him over other players that might be more premium? Do the Jets go tight end or offensive line? Well, depends on how highly they've graded Warren versus how big of a need they feel like offensive line is. Or, do the team like the Panthers say, hey, tight end would be a nice thing to be able to upgrade for us. They don't have, they got Tommy Tremble as their number one tight end, who's okay, but they could use a big weapon for Bryce Young. Or they say, hey, this defense really needs a lot more of an investment. We just can't afford to go tight end at that spot. It really could stretch in either direction, that either takes these skill players right off the board before the Bears ever have a chance to come near him. Or maybe the league as a whole is saying, hey, we don't want running back or tight end. And maybe Jeanty and Tyler Warren are both on the board with the 10th overall pick. I do think, given their status in a draft class that is otherwise underwhelming, I think the league will more broadly view Jeanty and Warren as among the top 7 or 8 prospects in this draft and in a separate tier from a lot of these other guys. And so they will be, I'm guessing that the allure of them being best player available will outweigh concerns about positional value or other team needs. And some teams in the top 10 before the Bears pick will likely take Ashton Jeanty. Warren, I'm a little bit less convinced goes before the Bears pick, but Jeanty, I feel like, doesn't get past the Saints at 9. Somebody takes him in the top 9 or somebody trades up for him in the top 9 before the Bears are on the clock. Warren is more of a coin flip for me as to whether he's there or not, because I don't know that there's as much consensus about him being the number one guy and as much consensus about him being like this guy that you got to have, as opposed to like the tight end class having a lot of other guys you like, and Colston Loveland being in that conversation for some teams as potentially the number one tight end ahead of him in this class.
Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. Managing money with your partner is smoother than ever. You can track shared and personal accounts, set goals, and stay on the same page without the stress. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast.
So I have a couple of former coworkers who have done mock drafts, and one of them I know is a 2-round mock, and that's courtesy of Brentley Weissman, who used to work with me at the Draft Network. We're going to touch on the first round of that mock, and then Connor Rogers, who was a former coworker for a brief period of time at the Draft Network. He did a mock draft, and the former first draft combo of McShay and Kuiper did mock drafts, and going to talk about what they gave the Dolphins, and then we'll finish with the Tyreek Hill stuff. So I will start with Brentley Weissman. And if you're not familiar with Brentley and Brentley's background, Brentley is a former NFL and college scout. Worked for the Chargers for a period of time, worked for the Oregon Ducks program. He's an Oregon alumni. Very smart guy. I have a great deal of respect for Brentley for the pathway that he took, getting into NFL scouting early, then transition to college, and now on the media side of things. And we shared a couple of draft cycles together, and he's made me a smarter analyst and my perspective of how I consume the game. So a couple of things about before pick 13 in Brentley's mock that stand out to me. The Shedeur Sanders scenario that played out as we went through kind of trade up hypotheticals or trade down for the Dolphins hypotheticals. Sanders went at 9, so he didn't get past kind of that magic threshold of where maybe you would see a team make the leap up the board. Interestingly enough, some names that were on the board when the Dolphins picked Will Johnson was on the board. The corner from the University of Michigan, Jahdae Barron, was on the board of the cornerback, defensive back from the University of Texas. Neither one of those players the pick. Brentley gave the Dolphins Tyler Warren, the tight end out of Penn State. I've done this pick in a mock before. It was a while ago. I don't think there's any question. Like the fit is apparent. And, you know, between Julian Hill and Pharaoh Brown, who the Dolphins really didn't give a lot of long-term money to, it is a player who I think could be a force multiplier for the offense in both the passing game and the running game. So I see the value of making the pick. It does not address one of your primary needs, but I'm really going to try to keep the perspective. And you know, let's wait and see what the entirety of the roster looks like. You shouldn't have to pigeonhole that, even though the Dolphins have needs. Now, is this maybe a potential hypothetical trade down scenario where Will Johnson's on the board and Jahdae Barron, as we mentioned, and you have an opportunity with another quarterback and Jackson Dart, who is on the board with this pick? I don't know. Does a team, would you take a trade down for a team to get in front of Indy who might otherwise take Tyler Warren for themselves? I can't say that for certain. I'm not mad about the pick. I understand the pick. I think it's a great fit. Tyler Warren's one of my six or seven best overall talents on my Dolphins specific draft board, I believe. Let me pull up the exact number. I like to have the horizontal board, which we kind of looked at a little bit yesterday. Tyler Warren's 7th, tied for 5th. I have the same grade for the Dolphins on Tyler Warren as I do for Will Johnson. How can I be mad at that pick? Tied for 5th place. Tied for the 5th best fit. You give him a 13. Now, it doesn't address your needs, which puts more pressure on young players and later draft picks and free agency with veteran players and potentially swinging a trade and getting really creative. That's the reality of the world that the Dolphins are living in as a whole. But that pick at 13 is not going to fix all your problems no matter what. Connor Rogers, his scenario. He has Shedeur Sanders sliding. Where does Shedeur goes? Well, this is a what would he do mock, which is worth putting that label on it because he actually does not have Shedeur going at all in the first round. He doesn't have Jackson Dart in the first round at all. So Connor, with his exercise for NBC Sports on if he was the GM for all 32 teams, really underscores the separation that he thinks exists with Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. Players that are on the board, Tyler Warren goes to Dallas. Malachi Starks is the pick for the Dolphins at 13. It's a very popular one. But in quick succession afterwards, you have Will Johnson at 16, Kenneth Grant at 17, Gray Zabel at 18, Derek Harmon, who we've talked about as a potential fit at 21. So no shortage of options, and Brent and Connor doing a mock that is, what would I do specifically? I think he kind of echoes some of what we've talked about those being the right kinds of players in that range and stratosphere. And I love the fact that he has Gray Zabel slotted in there too as a player who, well, maybe at 13 as an interior guy, you don't love the value, but I think he's a high floor player with a high ceiling as well. And guys like that at positions of need, like if you can get down just a little bit and coax somebody up to get a better player, that selection plus added value is not a bad world and hypothetical to live in.